All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest back again, fan favorite, Mike Stutz. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Am I like Steve Martin on Saturday Night Live? Am I leading in appearances on the podcast?
It's either you or Michael White. But and he'll do stuff. He'll be like, we'll be having a drink and he'll say, why does everyone wear number 42 on, Jackie Robinson Day?
Right.
And he knows, but he's like, we need to do a podcast about that. So there'll be this random podcast in there about like.
So he's just better at pitching you than I am. Yeah. I just need to pitch more ideas.
And more geographically convenient. So
here, we're doing a podcast with my next door neighbor once again.
Yeah. So Hollywood producer, writer, and director. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Director of the film Don't Change the Subject, which is fabulous. By the way, I should ask you, so here's how I've been starting my podcast. I do that. You can give me professional advice.
Okay.
So I do that. This is Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. I say hi to the guest. And then I read that thing you wrote for me. Sure. Which is in this podcast. I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. And Mike Stutz is certainly doing that. Now, what do you think? Is that like a good open or?
Yeah, I wrote it, so it's an excellent open. It's absolutely.
Is that like the right way to do it and to pace it?
Well, I don't know. You're kind of underselling it now, so I don't know. But sure, yeah, just launch right in. Impressive wordsmith, poet, and singer.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing that doesn't work. Podcasts have all started doing like cold opens. Yeah. So they'll take something from the middle of the podcast.
Right.
But it's not that cool because you'll all of a sudden you'll be like, and so that's why George Bush did this, and then you're like, but since. In a podcast app, you can actually make that mistake yourself.
Right.
I invariably think that I'm starting in the middle of something.
Maybe we could just do some fake. What we do when we do sizzles to sell shows is we don't have time to shoot a whole show. That's the point. You've got maybe a day or two with a potential star of a show.
Right.
So you shoot like half scenes, you shoot fake scenes because you just want to show what the show will kind of look like.
Right.
So maybe we could just do that for the top of the then he hit me with the fish and I'm on fire. Now I realize like people's radios or their speakers are blowing out as I scream into the microphone, but
that's good radio. So here's a couple of things I've doing the podcast that I've learned. So is this a thing that happens like in acting or like when I first did it?
Yes.
50 episodes ago. I'm like, I'm pretty good. Like I'm pretty funny. I keep it moving. I sound pretty good. I can do like the radio voice thing.
Sure.
And then like 50 in, I'm like,
you're terrible.
I don't feel like I'm that good. Like dragging.
It's like golf. When you start playing golf, like the first time you hit the fairway, you're like I'm actually getting pretty good at this, and then you start thinking about it, and you realize how terrible you are and how far you have to go. Yeah. So I certainly know from personal experience. I think about, I can think about any job that I've had, but certainly producing. When I think of my early documentaries or infotainment or whatever you want to call them, the stuff that I did in the beginning, I look back on those and they were terrible. They were really amateur hack jobs. That now I could do so much better. And it is, you try not to dwell on stuff like that too much because there are certain shows that, I did a couple that I butchered pretty badly that I so wish I had back. It's like, oh, now I get it. Right. Now, of course, when you interview me for my 30th interview in 10 years, I'll be like referring back to now as, oh, God, I was a hack. So I don't know that it ever stops, but I certainly understand the concept that oh boy, like you listen to your early things like, oh my, what was I talking about there? But
it certainly gives me appreciation for guys like, a little bit Charlie Rose, but even Howard Stern, where I'm like, how the hell do you keep a conversation moving and I get how you do it, but it's impressive that you do that for 6 hours a day.
Charlie Rose chooses to ask questions that are 16 times longer than the answers he gets. I got to say, I used to love Charlie Rose. Sorry, Charlie, I'm sure you're listening, and I apologize, but I used to really like Charlie Rose, but man, over the years, like he has become such a mouthpiece for people in power. Like he's such a sycophant.
Well, I've heard. I don't know if I can do a Charlie Rose impression, but we'll ask someone a question about something like, so why did you do this? And then he will proceed to give them 3 answers. Like, is it because you felt this? Or while the person tries to start an answer,
right?
An interesting person, like a director or producer or something, and he'll be like, is it because of this or this or this? You kind of go, okay.
They did a great job in Royal Tenenbaums of doing a fake Charlie Rose show where the guy's being interviewed by the, clearly a Charlie Rose. Right. And every time he opens his mouth, then Charlie Rose just keeps on going. And that is, as someone who interviews people for a living, that is a terrible mistake to make. Like, let people tell you their story, and then the other thing that, is I think a good way to go is don't say anything, and then people will fill the space. Like, they will want to fill the space, so they will tell you more and probably be more honest with you. But if you give them a break by constantly talking, you'll never hear their real story because they'll disagree with you. It's the old 60 Minutes parrot interview where they just say, would you say that you were this? And then they go, yes, I was this. And they're just giving back what the person came in with rather than actually listening and maybe getting an answer you weren't expecting.
Well, or Mark Maron. I should have pausing and waiting. See you say
my parents beat me.
That doesn't work very well. That's not a very good technique at all.
Now you can use that in the cold open. Just my parents beat me. So, exactly. But we're gonna get calls.
Yeah.
But,
Mark Maron. And what I didn't realize, Mark Maron, I think is great. I'm fascinated by his podcast. But what I realized later on is his podcasts are fascinating because it's comedians, like it's Patton Oswalt, who are trained to be very funny, and will talk about I did heroin and then I got off of it. Whereas I'll talk to people in Silicon Valley who are like, oh, I have terrible things to say about Sheryl Sandberg. I'm like, oh, wow, that's great radio. Like, I ain't saying that on the...
Right, yeah. You definitely get that. Yeah, I get that with celebrity. I had that with Don't Change the Subject, where all of these people I knew had suicide in their life. For the few of you who don't know what Don't Change the Subject is, it is a movie about suicide, but it's actually sort of an uplifting suicide prevention movie. And I knew a lot of celebrities who had either attempted themselves or had lost someone in their family. And when I started the movie, I thought, I'll interview them and they'll talk to me about it. And I got turned down by everybody because I'm not talking about that on the air. Yeah. I'm not talking about that in a movie. Yeah. I'll talk about that over a drink or something. But
and Mark Maron talks about people say things in the podcast and ask him to take it out. And he says he generally just says no. He's like, that's the deal. I won't take it out. Once in a while he will. If it's like someone says, my mom's phone number is 5, whatever it is. He'll still go back and take that out. But as a rule, he's not I'm not going to edit out. You sounded dumb here.
I find Mark Maron, I like Maron's podcasts. I find that when he is talking to other comics or people in sort of his wheelhouse, they're great because they have a lot of shared experiences. Sometimes he'll interview, a filmmaker or someone, and clearly he doesn't know anything about them. And I think even he defends himself with I don't want to know. Yeah. I'll learn the listener is learning. I'm not sure I totally agree with it. I feel like you should know the background. Now, again, I've so far critiqued Charlie Rose and Mark Maron because I'm an expert, because my career has taken off so much. But I do think you owe it to the filmmaker to maybe know their films. And I remember him, I can't remember who the filmmaker was, but it was so clear that Mark Maron had seen one of his movies. The guy had made, 20. Yeah. But so he just kept asking about one, it's just well, what about Home Alone 2? It's well, I also did,
Well, Mark Maron has a very funny, a lot of very funny podcasts, but one where there's two directors that have the same name.
Right.
I forget what they are. It's an Irish...
The story would be much better if you...
Yeah. I forget what happens in this story, and I forget what the point of this...
How's the podcast doing, by the way, Kent?
Yeah, it's great. It's two directors. He's an Irish director, and he has the one over, and the punchline is that he's researched the wrong one and kind of fakes his way through it.
Right.
But then later contacts the other director and says, I prepared to interview you when I thought I was interviewing you, and now you want to... And so he
that's great honesty on his part, so that's good.
I also think there's another thing he has, which I think he's getting paid... Now when he does a podcast and there's two subjects, he's being paid to promote the first one. So Patton Oswalt has a movie coming. So a lot of times he's not familiar with those, but I think it's because... Comedy Central paid him to...
Yeah, but if you didn't know, if I'm interviewing Patton Oswalt, I want to know about not just the fact that he was on King of Queens. You go oh, wait, what about the days in Largo when you're working in the 90s and you're a big movie buff and you wrote a book that's really good. That's the point, is you wouldn't know to ask the question. I suppose you can just say, tell me about what's going on in your life. But celebrities are so... Not Patton Oswalt, but other celebrities are so trained to sort of stay on the mark, focus on promoting whatever they're working on. The publicist has drilled it into them. You have to know how to go fish out some other stuff that's interesting. Hey, you started, Patton Oswalt started out, or didn't start out, he started out in Washington, D.C., but but was at a little club in San Francisco that he writes a lot about.
Yep.
I'd love to hear about his days at that club, and if I don't have any handle on any of that, I'm not going to even know to throw that out there.
Yeah.
And so I mean, yes, I suppose we're all learning as we go, but hopefully your subject. I mean, you know me, but that's why I'm on. I just happen to be someone that you know, so you have some background. You don't have to do any research. Just go. I have a very short section in Wikipedia, so it's not,
Well, here's this will be my final thing of it. I'm learning about the creative, call a podcast creative, but it's funny. Like I'll have people come up and go, "Yeah, I heard your thing. Yeah, this week it wasn't very good. Like, you kind of sucked."
Yeah,
which is kind of like I'm like, I get like when in my work. Nobody ever goes, yeah, that last company you were working at, you sucked. Yeah. Like, you were not a good executive. It was kind of stupid. You were better before. I don't know. And, like, with a podcast, people are like, that was kind of boring.
Oh,
like, wow.
People, I mean, I guess it's good feedback. But, no, people do that. Obviously, some of what I do, a good chunk of it is reality television, or at least related to reality television. And people feel very free to be like, essentially, oh, what you do is crap. You do this terrible thing. Like, well, what do you do? I don't, I'm the first to call a lot of reality television crap, but it's a little like Seinfeld had an episode where the woman's just like, I can't date someone I don't respect what they do. He's like, you're a cashier. And there is a certain level of like, hey, how come you just get to rip on just because you've seen TV, like you don't know whether I'm doing a good or a bad job. Fine, you can dislike reality, but I fairly consistently, like if you're out to dinner with people, they'll just talk about the worst reality TV they've ever seen and assume that you did it. That
is you, right?
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, well, all right, I'm going to rip into your accounting business. Like, hey, there's a lot of crooked accountants, aren't there? A lot of them go to jail.
Yeah.
Is that you?
Deloitte & Touche, is that you? I heard of them. I ain't heard of you. I heard of your accounting firm.
Yeah, so, I mean, let me make fun of it first, at least. But,
exactly.
So I guess that's what we're here for. All right.
Let's get to it.
Now your first question is, all reality television is terrible. You're responsible for Donald Trump. Oh.
So that is true, right? We don't, hey, we're in a fact-free environment now. So
we sure are.
So I won't do this forever, but I've recently here in the United States, people listen to the podcast around the world, here in the United States.
Although now you're not evergreen. See, now you're
I know. But I think the topic will be good for a few years.
Yeah, when we're all in the work camps or whatever, sure.
Yeah, in the first Trumpian dynasty. So here in the United States, recently, Donald Trump was elected president, much to the surprise, although I would argue should not have been that big a surprise, of a lot of people. And since you are a reality TV expert and producer,
yes,
he kind of came out of that realm. And we had a podcast where we talked about what were we talking about? It was like the
sort of bad behavior, modeling bad behavior.
TV kind of creating a norm, and then the norm actually becoming the norm, and this is kind of an extreme example of that. So, Donald Trump, President of the United States, reality TV star.
First off, I will say this would be the part of the podcast. As soon as I heard Donald Trump, I'd be like, I'm going to get mad, and I just turn it off. So, folks, we promise prizes if you stay tuned on this live podcast.
Well, I think the disclaimer, by the way, I think we're both fairly liberal and did not want Donald Trump to win.
Yes.
I think it's a bad thing that he's won, and I think it's been well covered.
Now we're going to get nailed by the trolls, and both of us are just our Twitters are going to our Twitters.
Everybody I meet all day long is like, oh man, bummer about the election. I'm like, I agree, but you're really taking a risk. Like 50% of the country doesn't think that's bad news,
right? Or like 24%.
Yeah, 24. Whatever the number is.
No, Trump definitely is you have to give reality TV some credit. I don't think reality TV made him. He was certainly famous before he got The Apprentice. But I think the interesting thing, I mean, I know a lot of people that worked on the show. I know a guy who ran the show actually for several years, The Apprentice, who himself is, liberal and certainly not a Trump fan. And I know a lot of people who worked camera and sound, and man, they were getting hounded by the press trying to get clips from the show and all that stuff. And a friend of mine who did sound and actually mic'd Trump himself a lot was like, I don't keep tapes from 10 years ago. Like, I don't have every bit of audio I've ever worked on. I didn't save that. But I think that the biggest responsibility that reality TV probably bears in this is that unlike if you did a documentary or you did a biography on someone and it was completely inaccurate, you would probably get called on it. You get called on it in reviews. Viewers, people would say, wait a minute, that isn't that person. You know, if you want to say JFK fought in the Civil War, you can, but someone's going to point it out.
Right.
Whereas reality television doesn't have any fact checking and doesn't have to live up to that standard. But people still go, oh, that's a person, that's a real person, not, oh, that's an actor playing a role.
Right.
And in this case, Trump is an overbearing idiot who was an overbearing idiot on set with that show, and they certainly could have made him look like a total buffoon. I mean, some might argue he does look like a buffoon on that show, and it just depends on what you like out of your television. But they went out of their way to make him look at least, wow, this brash guy, and he really tells it like it is, and those kind of things. And they drop out his terrible sexist comments, his weird racist ways. They drop all of that by the side because that doesn't do them a service. Nobody wants to watch the show.
Like that show, I recall, like in retrospect, at the time, the story of the show was like big, successful business guy, judges, up and comer. And at the time, I was like, Donald Trump, successful. Like, isn't he the guy who went bankrupt, and he's kind of cheesy, and he's in real estate, and that's not really that.
Right. You give him credibility to a large crowd of people who are willing to buy that. I guess that's the danger with these shows.
But they were writing that story, I guess, is what I'm saying. Is the idea was this is a big, successful business guy. They probably would have taken Warren Buffett over him if they got Warren Buffett.
I have no doubt
wasn't available that
I don't
day.
know if they created the show for Trump specifically or not. But yes, if Trump hadn't taken it, it would have been some other alleged billionaire
who would go on TV.
And then would fit the script that they wrote for him. And it's not a coincidence that, Mark Burnett, now I'll never work in TV again, but Mark Burnett is not a liberal by any stretch of the imagination, and is probably a fan of a lot of things that Trump likes, and that's another. I mean, I don't want to get too far off topic here, but that is, someone asked a reporter many years ago. They said, "Well, isn't the media? It's a liberal media, and if you do studies, you show that reporters, by and large, are liberals." He was like, yeah, that's probably true, but the people who own the company aren't. Like the people, those are the people who decide what goes in and what goes out. Right. In this case, Burnett being the producer of The Apprentice is not a surprise. Right. That I don't think that Mark Burnett thought, oh, we're going to get this guy in the White House. But with these shows, and I don't think there's unfortunately a great answer, but you can make anybody look any way you want. It's not hard. I think, personally, it's easier to make someone who's a crappy person look good than it is to make a good person look bad. You could do it either way. Yeah. But, the way you edit it, the way you put music under it, what you choose to use and what you choose to not use, they can say enough sort of innocuous stuff that even if they're a real blowhard asshole, you can still make them look, at least, wow, he just tells it like it is. And if you actually, heard another part of that sentence, or you heard it unedited, you'd be, oh, good God, he sounds incompetent. But and that happens with a lot of these shows. I have been lucky. I do, hard as it may be to believe, I do try to pick and choose shows as much as I can. Not always, like sometimes you work on what you work on. But I try not to do what I would call sort of kicking the balls television, where people are sort of actively being harmed. But I can think of a specific example. I won't say who it was, but a show I did many years ago, where the star of the show, a reality show, was a really bad guy, like really unpleasant, and he was not just an unpleasant guy, but I think he actively made the world sort of a worse place. Right. And our job was to make him look good, and to make him look like a fun, free spirit, and in particular, he was also a pretty crappy dad. He wasn't abusive or anything illegal, but he was really just not a good dad. And we made him look like a really good dad on the show, and people would compliment the show a lot on, oh, this is so great to see that he's so good with his kid. And the moment the camera stopped rolling, he'd walk away from the kid, and like we'd play with the kid. And we aren't sworn to some code of reality ethics or whatever, but you do create a world where a lot of people who really shouldn't be given a chance to speak to the public and to look good are getting made to look good. And then people are shocked when Duck Dynasty guys come out and they're, crazy right-wing rednecks. Yeah. That people are surprised. It's like, what do you think the guys from Duck Dynasty are? Now, they sort of reined them in and kept them under, kept their true feelings under wraps as much as they could. But once they got famous enough and were getting a huge amount of viewers, then of course, like, the truth will out. And that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of people that don't agree with the guys from Duck Dynasty and all of their views. There's a huge viewing audience who would say, yes, I'm with them. But you now live in your sort of post-truth world. You have all these fake documentaries that are reality shows.
Right.
I don't believe that people think they're documentaries, but I also think that people kind of think those human beings are somewhat like they're portrayed on the show. If it's Snooki on, Jersey Shore, yeah, that's probably her. Yeah. Like, although even that show's scripted, so I don't really know what she's like as an individual. Yeah. But, and that sort of extends, I think, beyond even the stars of the shows. You have a lot of shows that are built to look a little like a documentary, where you might have something on that is purporting to have historical, accuracy.
Right.
But the people who are writing them are not, and I speak as someone who's written some of them, are not historians. They're not journalists. They're not used to fact checking on the level that someone at the New York Times would need to fact check. They're Googling and Wikipediaing and hopefully reading some books, and hopefully they bring some knowledge. I'm not saying that they're just pulling anybody off the street, but I remember, now this again was many, many years ago, so it was much looser at that time, but I remember a producer I knew who was a very nice human being, but, maybe not a huge amount of education. And they were supposed to do factoids on the show, and they were supposed to, put in these, oh my God, you can't believe this statistic. And so she had put in a factoid about the statue of Christ in Brazil, in Rio, and its size. And she somehow, in her calculations, calculated out that the statue of Christ was 10 times the size of the Statue of Liberty. And it was like going to air. It was like going to graphics, and nobody said what. And I looked at it, and I wasn't her boss, but I just happened to see her script, and I was like, I ran the calculations on that. It would have made the Statue of Christ, a mile high and like 300 billion tons or whatever. It would have been this huge thing seen from space. Yeah. And I was like, nobody thought, oh, does that seem off? Does that seem slightly off? And those kind of things can sort of slip through. And another way that they slip through is these same producers. So I'll say a producer is doing whatever, a History Channel show, and they have meticulously researched it, and it's been prepped. And to History Channel's credit, they do have historians look at stuff. It's not like it just goes, but they'll have historians look at stuff at some point. Now, they may make an editorial change towards the end that, oh, we can't use that shot of whatever, we can't use that footage, so let's pull that out, let's pop something else in. And the context can get a little loose, and pictures can move, and all of a sudden you're talking about a figure that isn't the picture you're seeing, or it didn't fit timing wise, so part of a interview bite's pulled out, but it changes the context of everything. Right. And if it was a news organization, with some credibility, there would still be an end fact check of like, hey, wait, and this is not me accusing History Channel of being inaccurate, right. But whatever the channel, there's always going to be one last set of hands, and it's probably not the set of hands that did the majority of the work on it. It's probably an editor or someone in a post house or a supervisor or an executive producer who just goes, why is that in there? And I can remember doing a show where they just didn't like the pictures we had, so they just put in pictures of other people as this notorious killer who wasn't that guy. Right. Well, that guy, those people have families, right? Right. Wait, so now you just put in a picture of someone's grandpa as a serial killer, but that's not him, Yeah.
Yeah, History and Discovery, like those channels, so sort of cloak themselves, but they're, it's called the History Channel. They, the shows are introduced in a voice that's like very, like,
sure.
They could say, 2 + 2 is 7. Right. And you're halfway to believing it just on it is the History Channel. It's not entertainment television. It's, whatever it is.
If you're doing a History Channel show, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but if you're doing a History Channel show, and I don't want to pick on them, there's, whatever it is, Discovery, TLC, you name it. If you're doing a good job, what you're probably trying to do is you've interviewed 20 people for the show, and you're trying to take their information and edit those interviews together in a way that makes a coherent and interesting story that holds you. So that's fine. So it means that everyone who's been interviewed probably knows what they're talking about. Let's assume that you got good interviews, which, again, you tend to get like whoever's available at that time, and they will be sitting here like this and maybe doing a little bit more casual interview. They may not, it's not quite the same as standing in front of a classroom and delivering a lecture, but fine. We'll assume that all 20 of them are reputable and that they were accurate throughout their interview. But as you start to, you cut from one interview to another. You never let any interviewer go more than maybe 15 or 20 seconds typically. So that means that if you're going to make a point about James Madison, I need 3 different guys to give me a 1-minute clip on Madison. So I'm going to take sort of the beginning of this guy, the middle of this guy, and then the end of this woman, right? But now I may be changing the context of the answer by putting those 3 things together. She's giving an answer that this guy up top started. Was the point he was making that finish? You know what I mean? Like you're putting a puzzle together that was all accurate in its beginning, but is it accurate when it finishes? Hopefully, yes. Hopefully you're paying attention. Hopefully you're being ethical, and your boss is being ethical, and your editor and everybody else is going, is that what the War of 1812 is really all about? Or is that a really great, I mean, I remember doing, I did a 8-hour miniseries on the presidency, and I worked very hard. I worked most of a year. I did read a ton for it. It was very enjoyable for me. But I'm not a history major, So I had my interpretation of what I was reading. I feel that I'm a reasonably bright person. I don't think I did a bad job on it. But again, I wasn't the last one to touch that. It went on for months with graphics houses way after I was done. But there was someone was talking about Washington D.C. at the in the early years of Washington D.C. It is, ironically, with Trump's Drain the Swamp, it was a swamp. Yeah. And it had wolves running through it. You would have to fight off wolves to get to Congress, Right. I found that fascinating. And also the image to me is that's going to be great. We can create all sorts of cool imagery off of that. Yeah. So I'm going to make that work. I need that to be in. So now I need something to guide me into it. And so then we're going to talk about, George Washington was a surveyor, and that's going to get me into this. And that's when Washington, D.C. started to be laid out. And I'm going to put together a bunch of quotes that are going to let me have my wolves, right? But do I start to dent the, overall intent of the interviews that got me there? Yeah. Do I take just the first part, or do I just take the wolves thing, and maybe the guy after, then 3 sentences later was like, well, but it wasn't a problem because, but I don't really want that part, So, and I guess I'm not sure, I cannot speak to it, but there are a lot of producers out there who may be well-meaning, but I think that I'm not trying to make myself sound good. As you know, I'm a terrible human being, but I do try to keep things accurate. And I'm not sure that every producer out there might feel the same, or even know that they're making a mistake. That you just made. You just gave Lyndon Johnson powers he never had. Right. You just took part of an interview that was actually about Eisenhower and kind of stuck it into the Lyndon Johnson part, and it'll be fine. We'll figure it out.
Well, and I think it's interesting that it sort of, you made this point where we talked before, that it sort of legitimizes the fact that if you're watching a movie like The Godfather, you understand that you're not those people. And if you're playing a video game, you understand you're not an 80-foot tall robot. I think I may have that argument, but you probably don't think you're that.
I had a brief period where I did think that.
Yeah, we all get that.
With medication, it all came through.
But you do watch a reality show, and you're like, oh, I have a girlfriend, and we yell at each other, and, well, that person just threw a coffee pot. I guess we throw a coffee pot.
Right. You don't necessarily model the behavior. You're not, oh, I just saw someone throw a coffee pot, let me throw a coffee pot. Right. But if you desensitize people to, ridiculous actions that really no one does, people just don't walk out and slam doors like that. But if it's constantly happening in a setting that is allegedly real human beings, and especially if you're a younger viewer, does that influence you? Now, I know I don't mean to grind an axe with one of your other podcast people, but I know that when you were reviewing probably my first appearance with another person, you were talking about, well, he sort of threw out there, but violent video games don't necessarily lead people to be violent. But it is different. That's the 80-foot robot. Right. I'm not sure. And they are showing there is some work being done out there showing that it is desensitizing audiences. It is, especially younger audiences, we are becoming a more and more base world, and it's not helping. I don't know how much it's making people do things, but it's probably not helping.
Yeah. Well, and I think there was a piece, my complaint about the Trump presidency, pending Trump presidency, is that it became evident to me early on. I didn't predict that he'd win, but I did think like the odds were closer to 25% than the 0.
Yes.
That everyone seemed to think. It became apparent at some point that like a lot of people didn't give a crap about hypocrisy. Like he would say, well, he said this, then he said this, he lied. And about the 50th time that happened, and it didn't change a lot of people's opinions, I sort of said, I think this stuff doesn't matter. Like you can post another John Oliver video on my Facebook timeline. That doesn't seem to be changing the odds.
Correct.
And so somewhere along the line, like my media complaint is that they kind of pushed those memes like further, not me. I mean, they were true. Like he truly said this and then truly said that, and they truly contradicted each other, and they were facts. But they were kind of confusing people that was having some impact on a whole other group of people who were like, no, I get it. Like I hear that's happening and I do it. I'm still going to vote for Donald Trump.
Yes.
And it took the first group of people who were getting more and more outraged and posting more and more on Facebook and kind of led some of them to then think the odds of Donald Trump winning were like 1% or 0% because it just seemed so ludicrous to them.
Yes. There's a real disconnect there. There's no question.
But there's clearly a group of people who were like, yeah, that's not bothering me as much as it's bothering you.
Well, I think also you get into, as you know, you and I had today's long side project where we're reading various religious texts, the Bible, the Quran, other texts, and we know from our experience with that oftentimes the religions that take off are the ones that are persecuted the most. That the more you're told, no, you're wrong, the more you think you're onto something. That the Mormons being a good example, that as they got run out of state after state,
right,
and people, almost literally with pitchforks running them out of the state, the more they said, oh, we must be doing something right, that your brain locks onto it. And so the more certainly first off, the more you're told you're a redneck idiot, the more you're going to go, disagree with that. And
or proudly so.
But also the more people tell you that you're just absolutely wrong and these are all lies, and how could you believe that? The more you're going to go, well, of course they're going to say that, and I don't want to get, well, no one gets letters, but there are sides both conservative and liberal that can be fact light. There's a big fight over, like, this is where I don't even want to say it because somebody's going to like jump down my throat, but. In
the letter they write to you?
Yeah, in the letter, in the pen, when they take their quill out.
Dear sir, regarding.
Yes, prithee. But, let's just say like GMOs and stuff, that's an open, the research may not back the vehemence that some people have about stuff. Yeah. Or people in affluent communities or liberal communities who won't vaccinate their kid. Yeah. Again, I know I think you did a podcast maybe on that, or perhaps not, but and I'm not going to jump into this. Please don't blow me up. But
we'll have Jenny McCarthy on.
Yeah, exactly. But you vaccinate your kid.
Yeah.
And that would be allegedly highly educated, often liberal parents who feel very, very strongly about this. So and the more they're told, no, that's wrong. That was one study. It was discredited. You really, there is no relationship. The more they go like,
that's what you'd say if there was a
right. That's what you'd say if there's a conspiracy out there. And I think that's the challenge is, and I don't know what the answer is, to back both sides up a little bit and say, can we at least have a conversation that has a fair amount of facts in it? I mean, I'm not going to say that the Trump supporters are the same as, I don't know that there's an equal number of issues out there that are totally distorted and misrepresented. Right. I think that having an education helps maybe sort some things out. But certainly there's such vitriol in what's going on that no one can have a conversation. And that is troubling.
Yeah.
And it is, if somebody just says, I know you are, but what am I? If they won't get past that, then how do you even have a discussion? If you can't quote the New York Times or the Washington Post and possibly have some level of credibility, I don't know where you go from that. If Breitbart equals New York Times, I don't know how we have this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that there is just this thing going on. I don't like in terms of, my friend Joe Garofalo, who works at the San Francisco Chronicle, kind of takes offense when you say, well, you guys didn't really cover Trump and all the bad stuff. He's like, we fact checked the guy and everything. We said 80% of what he wasn't true. Like, what else could we have done? And I do think the one thing that they did, in my sense, do wrong is, they acted like Hillary Clinton's path to victory was 99.9%. And so I think that enabled the behavior of, if you really didn't want Donald Trump to win, there's one thing you could do to stop it. That was vote for Hillary Clinton. But people thought it was so ridiculous that they did all kinds of things, like, I'm going to write in John Oliver, and, I'm going to...
didn't vote.
I'm not going to vote because they're both horrible and ick. I don't want to be involved. And that, enough people doing that, because they thought there was no chance and their friends are going to go vote, probably led him to victory more than, the people who voted for Trump won. The people who voted for Hillary lost. The people who were undecided won because somebody won. But the people who didn't want Trump to win and did something other than vote against him are the ones that kind of bother me. And if I need to blame the press for something, it's that the press sort of gave them the, look, your vote doesn't matter because, he's so bad. He's unqualified. Like, just to be clear, there's 2 qualifications to be president. Like
over 35
and U.S. citizen.
Yes.
Being a complete fucking idiot or saying one thing and then another is not actually on that list.
That might have knocked Andrew Jackson out, or Andrew Johnson, all Andrews pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. All right, folks, we'll wrap it up there for now, for this week. You don't need to be lingering on this podcast. That's Mike Stutz, of course, reality TV producer, director of the independent film Don't Change the Subject. Always a fave on the Something Venture podcast. People, we will be back next week. Thank you so much for listening. This is Something Venture.